When you are on the point of putting your hand to some undertaking, remind yourself what the nature of that undertaking is. If you are going out of the house to bathe, put before your mind what happens at a public bath. Those who splash you with water, those who jostle against you, those who vilify you and rob you. And thus you will set about your undertaking more securely if at the outset you say to yourself, I want to take a bath, and at the same time to keep my moral purpose in harmony with nature. And so do in every undertaking. For thus, if anything happens to hinder you in your bathing, you will be ready to say, Oh well, this was not the only thing that I wanted, but I wanted also to keep my moral purpose in harmony with nature, and I shall not so keep it if I am vexed at what is going on. Chapter 4 is actually one of my all-time favorite passages of Epictetus and Stoic philosophy in general, in part because it's so straightforward and prosaic and yet gets really to the heart of everything. And we could apply the advice that's given here to practically any activity that we engage in where we have some sort of expectations. So he's talking in general, and he says, when you are on the point of putting your hand to some undertaking, some ergon, some doing, some activity, remind yourself what the nature of that activity or that undertaking is. What kind of thing it is. Hopoion esti to ergon in the Greek. Don't just tell yourself, hey, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. Say to yourself, I'm going to do X, and X usually involves this sort of thing. And Y has these sorts of things that accompany it. And Z sometimes goes this way and sometimes goes that way. Remind yourself about what you're really getting yourself in for. So, this is actually advice that's quite useful, because when we have to expect something that we're not entirely happy about as an outcome, or as an impediment, or as something that could ruin or lessen an experience, we often want to push that aside. It's not going to be like that. I'm going to go to the amusement park, and it's going to be so great. I'm going to go on all the roller coasters and all the rides, and my kids are going to totally enjoy themselves. And you don't remind yourself of what it was like last time that you went, where there were all these crowds and it was hot and noisy, and this ride was broken. And, you bought some food, but the food wasn't very good, and, go on and on and on, right? So he has a great example here of going to the baths. He says, if you're going out of the house to bathe. Now, why is he talking about going out of the house to bathe? Well, because, this is ancient Greek and Roman culture, where you generally, some people did take baths at home, but they also had these great big public baths. And they were pretty cool places to go to. You get to look at other people and chat with them. And there were attendants who could rub you down with olive oil. And the people made a whole production out of this, right? Sort of like we make a big production of going to the gym or going to the spa. So, you might substitute something like that. I'm going to go to the spa. Or I'm going to go and have a workout at Planet Fitness or at the expensive gym or whatever you like, right? I'm going to go to the Y and lift some weights. I can do the same thing. I'm going to get up in front of my chalkboard and I'm going to give a lecture, I'm going to go and give a talk here, and there'll be people and they'll ask these great questions. We'll have great discussions. So he says, okay, so you're going to the bath. What is that actually like? He says, put before your mind what happens at a public bath. Don't just say to yourself the words, I'm going to go to the bath. Or think to yourself, this is going to be such a great experience. Remind yourself about what you actually know, because you've experienced it, or you can imagine it happening, or somebody else has experienced it and told you about it. So what happens? There's people who splash you with water. Right? It's like going to a public pool. Somebody's going to splash you. Sometimes you have a kid who just loves splashing people, right? Some people get in and they make a big splash. Some people aren't paying attention to what they're doing. Some people will jostle against you. They'll bump into you. Some will even vilify you and rob you. They'll say bad things. Some will steal your stuff. Now you can say, well, I'll make sure that I, go in with a lock and that way nobody will rob me. I don't know. When you go to a health club or you go to a pool, you can put all your stuff in, but even that key that you carry around, I suppose you could use a combination lock and put everything in there. You can get in the water and somebody can come along and take your towel. Somebody can take your spot. Go to the gym, you set your stuff down for a minute and it's gone. People talk all sorts of trash about other people. Sometimes, stupidly. Sometimes because they are unhappy with their own lives. Sometimes because they're miserable types of people. But people do that sort of thing. Similarly, I'll give you, an example from my own experience. I've had some lectures where I go and it's just a wonderful experience. I've had some lectures where I go and, not quite so great. A few people show up and somebody starts asking crazy questions that have nothing to do with the topic and making assertions. You get people coming up to you afterwards sometimes saying, oh, that was really great. I'd like to get on your mailing list. Can I find out about more? Other people come up to you and say, it was a nice lecture, but you really should have done this, and you didn't talk about this enough, and why did you give us a handout on that? Why didn't you give us a handout on this instead? And people will do this not only for paid lectures, where they are actually putting something on the table, but for free lectures, where they could have gone or not gone, and you're doing it entirely for free for them. So there's a lot of things we could talk about. Is the chalkboard going to work right? Every time you get on your computer, there's the potential that there's some sort of catastrophic failure that's going to happen. Every time you get out your phone. Every time you go out on a date. This would be a great reminder for going out on dates. What are dates like? You don't actually know the person that well. That's why you're going out on a date with them, to find out what they're like. And there's lots and lots of ways things can go bad just between the two people to make it less of an enjoyable experience. You could go to a restaurant and somebody gets food poisoning. The server isn't nice. The drinks are watered down. You go to see a band. The PA system isn't done well, hasn't been mixed. There's all sorts of things that could be happening. So what can you do? Now, this doesn't mean that you should just dwell forever like a doom and gloom person on everything that's going to go bad. But it does mean that you should, be realistic about what you're getting yourself in for. It says you'll go about your undertaking more securely. More securely. Secure in what sense? Secure in that you're not going to lose it. You're not going to get upset. If you say to yourself, I want to take a bath and at the same time to keep my moral purpose in harmony with nature. This is an extremely important phrase. The ideal for Epictetus, as for other Stoics, is to live in accordance with nature. That's the way it was framed at the beginning. Epictetus will talk much more in terms of maintaining one's moral purpose or faculty of choice. That is what in Greek is called the prohairesis. This is the core of the person. This is your moral compass. This is your capacity to reflexively choose what you're going to do, how you're going to feel, what you're going to think. It forms your habits. It is formed by your habits. It is what allows you to choose. It is also the product of the choices that you make. This is what you are, he says. Are you going to maintain that in accordance with nature, or are you going to allow it to get all out of whack, to be not in accordance with nature, to be discordant with nature. What does he mean by nature? He doesn't mean what we often talk about as natural. Oh, it's just natural that somebody cuts you off and you flip them the bird and yell at them or something like that. That's not natural, according to Epictetus. What is natural is what fulfills our potential as human beings. What is genuinely good for us and for other people. Living in harmony with them as best as we can, to the degree that, our idiosyncrasies allow us to do so. That is being in accordance with nature. Fulfilling your duties that you have is living in accordance with nature. Using appearances well, as he's going to talk about in other places. Living in accordance with nature. So when you go to the bath, and you know that people are going to do all these things, you can tell yourself, I don't just want to go to the bath, I also want to maintain my faculty of choice in accordance with nature. Or, if we want to talk in more contemporary parlance, I want to stay on the life track that I've chosen for myself. I don't want to fall into being upset, into losing my temper, into feeling ashamed or afraid, or having somebody get me to do something I don't want to do. That's a major distinction there. Now, if you don't think that you can go to the bath and deal with everybody's nonsense and also keep your proiresis in accordance with nature, then maybe you shouldn't go to the bath. Maybe it's better for you not to do that. If when you go to a concert today, it bothers you the fact that people have like an ocean of phones and they're all filming the people up on stage. So it does affect the light show that you see, because you see an ocean of little blue lights, right? And you find yourself saying, what's wrong with these dummies? Why can't they enjoy themselves? If that's going to be what's going to happen, and that's up to you, it doesn't have to happen that way, then maybe you should skip the concert. Particularly if you're going to be the person who gets upset because you're holding up your own phone and you don't want all these other people to have their phones on the image that you're taking of the band. There's a whole set of other problems involved with consistency there. But we can remind ourselves. We can be aware. We can be mindful as we move into situations about what they're likely to entail. We don't have to avoid going to the bath. We don't have to avoid going to the concert. We don't have to avoid going to the gym. We don't have to avoid getting into our car. We don't have to avoid going to class. But we should keep ourselves attuned to what it is that we're getting ourselves in for, and not, give ourselves all sorts of idealistic, imaginary assurances about how great everything is going to be. That's counterproductive from a Stoic perspective. It's not engaging with reality. So he says, do this with every undertaking. For thus, if anything happens to hinder you in your bathing, you'll be ready. You'll already be equipped to say, oh, well, this is not the only thing that I wanted, but I wanted also to keep my moral purpose in harmony with nature. And I shall not so keep it if I am vexed at what is going on. So you could go to the concert and, you think to yourself ahead of time, all right, what happens at concerts? A lot of people jostle each other. The beer is very expensive. It's kind of, tough getting in and out because there's so many crowds. The bouncers sometimes like to, prod and probe you a bit. But I want to see this band, and I want to see them in their native habitat up on stage. So I'm going to do that. But I also want to maintain my moral purpose in accordance with nature. I also want to hold it together. I also want to stay on track, right? So if things really go well, you get to have both of them. And you didn't waste your time thinking ahead of time, well, what could go wrong? What is likely to happen, even though it didn't happen? Because you're still having both things. You're having the great experience, and you're getting to maintain your progress. Now, if things go bad, somebody's a jerk to you. There's usually a lot of ways people are jerks at concerts, right? Well, you prepared for it. And now you can tell yourself, what I really want is to maintain my moral purpose in accordance with nature. And if that's what you see as most valuable, and Stoic philosophy does, then you will opt for that. So this is some really great advice that can, as he says, be put into practice with every single undertaking, every single activity that we choose to do. It is not the things themselves that disturb men, but their judgments about these things. For example, death is nothing dreadful, or else Socrates too would have thought so. But the judgment that death is dreadful, this is the dreadful thing. When therefore we are hindered, or disturbed, or grieved, let us never blame anyone but ourselves. That means our own judgments. It is the part of an uneducated person to blame others where he himself fares ill. To blame himself is the part of one whose education has begun. To blame neither another nor his own self is the part of one whose education is already complete. Chapter 5 is one of the probably most fruitful and most often commented on chapters, or at least the very first passage of it is, because it's so central to Stoic practice and Stoic approaches to things. It's influenced psychotherapy, quite important. So let's take a look. Let's jump right in. He says, it is not the things themselves that disturb people, but their judgments about these things. People are troubled, trashe, not by things themselves, pragmata, the things, states of affairs, things that happen to us, things that go on with our own body, right? But our opinions, our viewpoints, our judgments, our, in Greek, dogmata, about those things. So these don't even necessarily have to be things that we ourselves have thought up ourselves, through our own activity. It could be things that we've internalized that other people have said, like, you should always look out for number one, right? You hear that often enough, and you make that your dogma. It's your opinion that you now bring, or your idea that you now bring to everything, and you're placed into a situation where you can't just look out for yourself, and you have to, take care of somebody else, and now you're upset, right? Or, winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. That's a horrible thing to say to kids, and actually to adults, right? Winning is not the only thing. There's a lot of other things as well, but if you've got that dogma in your head, and you're bringing it to bear, what happens when you lose? What happens when you get second place? You're going to be quite upset. So how we think about things, the opinions, the ideas, the judgments that we bring to bear as we take in the world, as we move around in the world, as we experience things, that's what really hurts us. That's what upsets us. It's not the things themselves. When we get angry, it's not just something happening and impinging on us. It's also what we're contributing to the situation, what we're bringing in. Somebody bumps you, right? And you don't know whether or not they did it on purpose, but you're already a little hot and tired and having to get somewhere, and you turn around and you say, "What's up with you, jerk?" You've actually made a decision there. That was not just a reflex action. You brought to bear some idea about what was going on. You attributed to that person, whether it's true or false, that they did that on purpose, and that the best thing for you is to call them a jerk and maybe elbow them back or something along those lines. There's a lot of cases that we could talk about. So he says, for example, here's a big example, right? Death. Death is nothing dreadful. Why do we know that death is nothing dreadful? Well, death is actually something dreadful for many people, isn't it? You say, I'm afraid of death. Death is not dreadful in itself. if it's dreadful for you, you're contributing something that's making it so. What's the evidence for that? There's a very simple argument. If death was truly dreadful, everybody would feel dread at death. And he gives one example, but we could think of many other people who don't. Socrates. Socrates, who the Stoics look at as kind of a heroic figure, he drank the hemlock himself. As a matter of fact, his jailer told him, hey, don't be talking so much, the last day of your life with all these friends of yours, because when you drink the poison, it might not work right away, and then I'll have to mix up another batch. And Socrates says, this is my last day. I'm going to talk if I want to. Mix up another batch, because maybe you'll need it. You can count on me to drink the poison, because I'm going to follow what my city has decreed in saying that I must be executed, and that I'm the one who's got to do it. But you handle your business, I'll handle mine. I'll do what's up to me, the ton epumon, right? And Socrates was not afraid of death. And it wasn't just because he had this idea that, I'm going to go to a better place or anything like that. He spends his last few hours in conversation about the nature of death and the soul and the body, but he's not bothered by it. If he was bothered by it, he would have never gone to trial in the first place. Or after he went to trial, he would have taken Crito's preferred opportunity to get out of town and go somewhere else and live in exile. Crito bribed the jailers. He didn't do that. So it's not death itself that's dreadful, but the judgment that death is dreadful. That is the dreadful thing. It's dreadful in two ways. So it makes death something dreadful, the judgment that death is dreadful. It's also something dreadful or fearful or something we should be afraid of to have that very judgment. Because it makes our life is the opposite of death. It makes our life something where we have to have bad experiences about something we haven't yet endured or encountered. So our own death is not something that we need to fear. It is up to us. It's our choice whether we have that judgment, that dogma, or not. That's up to us. We get to choose what we fill our head with. So he goes on, and he says, when, therefore, we are hindered or disturbed or grieved, when we have negative experiences, when things don't go our way and then we react badly because we're not happy about that, as we euphemistically say, we're actually unhappy about it, he says, let's not blame anyone but ourselves. Whose fault is it that you feel a certain way? It's not somebody else's fault. It's your fault. They may have done some things. They may have acted like a jerk. They may have been thoughtless. But it's your judgments that contribute to why you feel that way. You're the one who is interpreting what it is that they're doing. They may act with complete malice, but a Stoic doesn't have to, therefore, feel all sorts of negative emotions, like being upset or being terrified of that person, or, being in a rage against that person, or being indignant that person gets away with what they're doing. That's a choice. So he says, let us blame our own judgments. Blame ourselves, blame our own judgments. So notice what he's saying there. Don't blame yourself, like say, oh, you're such a terrible person. There's nothing good about you whatsoever. Look at the part of yourself that is actually getting yourself in this trouble. If you have a bad temper because you're constantly judging that people are disrespecting you, and you're adding that to perhaps the fact that they are disrespecting you, right? You don't have to condemn your entire self. You can say, well, that's not a good part of me, that part of me that has those judgments. Maybe other parts of yourself are very good. Hopefully they are. And you can start working on that one part. It's very important to isolate out where we're going wrong. So he says, it's the part, now this is a great phrase here, it's the part of an uneducated person to blame others where he himself fares ill, where he does poorly because of his own screwing up. So there's lots and lots of people in the world who think that the world is screwed up, but they're not screwed up. And the very fact that they think that the world is so screwed up and it upsets them is part of how they're screwed up. The world is what it is. The world works the way the world works. And to expect it or demand that it be something totally different, that's totally unrealistic. And setting oneself up for all sorts of moral failures. People don't, in general, want to take responsibility. It's the other political party's problem. It's those people over there. It's the hierarchy, the patriarchy, the liberals, the conservatives, the blah, 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 blah. Anybody but me. Stoics are saying, no, it's you. Pay attention to your own part in it. Those other people, if they actually have some blame, you can blame them all you like after you looked at your own part. See whether you have some responsibility. Actually, if you do that, you're probably going to get to the point where you're not so worried about all of them. Because we do this as a way of projecting the screwed upness, the damage that's inside of ourselves onto everything else so we don't have to face up to it as being in us. But it should be no surprise when we see it recurring over and over and over again that the problem is in us. So that's the uneducated person, the person who has not been, trained, who's not been disciplined. Then he says, to blame oneself is the part of one whose education has begun. Education in how to live, in Stoic philosophy. When you start doing that, you'll have the experience, which is not a fun experience, of looking at yourself and saying, wow, I'm pretty messed up. There's a lot of things that I've been telling myself for years where I'm well off. I'm not so well off. When I face up to things and look at myself honestly, when I let in the antiseptic of sunlight, as we say, into the dark recesses of my soul, not really happy with what I'm seeing. So they blame themselves. But that's not the end of it. He says, to blame neither another nor his own self is the part of one whose education is already complete. The goal is to get to the point where you're not criticizing, you're not complaining about, you're not finding all the bad stuff in yourself, and you're not doing it with other people and the world. You're actually happy. You're actually free. You're actually undisturbed, tranquil. So, how do these all connect with each other? How do we get from the beginning part of it's not the things themselves that disturb people, but our judgments about these things, to all this discussion of blame? Well, when we start actively and honestly looking at our own psychological makeup, at our own tendencies, at our own judgments about things, that's some of the stuff that we've been using to blame other people, where really we should be blaming ourselves, criticizing ourselves, not so that we just tear ourselves apart, but so that we can make good changes that will shift us away from that and towards something that's more healthy, more wholesome, something that we can really get behind, and eventually so we can love ourselves as we are.